Hi everyone, welcome to the Aerobic Metabolism section of your lecture. And again, I want to cover, or at least give thanks and acknowledgement to Wolters Kluwer Publishing, which is the publisher of the textbook we're currently using in class. They provided the images and the foundation of the slides, primarily that these video lectures are based off of. So let's review and remind ourselves of our learning objectives to start with. I have separated the top about 6 learning objectives that deal primarily with the biochemistry and the biochemical processes of aerobic metabolism. And then we get into the training effects and adaptations that occur, as well as how to measure and just some other periphery type important objectives to know in and around oxidative metabolism. Okay, and you'll notice that those terms are interchangeable. So aerobic activity uses oxidative metabolism, and yeah, we'll get into that. So as far as the way the aerobic metabolism lectures are set up, or this section of the course, we'll have this intro video, and I want to speak to try to set a framework for you to be able to separate what anaerobic and aerobic activities are and how they work. But more importantly, to have a little bit of an understanding, even like out of the gate here, how the two interact and interplay. Because again, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, it's not like a light switch where you go purely from anaerobic to flip of the switch, now purely aerobic. There's a bit of a overlap there. So we'll speak to that and cover briefly what your aerobic metabolism system looks like. Okay. Then we'll get into specifics. So how is ATP produced, in particular through aerobic metabolism for the Krebs cycle? And then there will be another video. It should be like 2A, 2B. So 2B is the electron transport chain. And those two systems produce quite a bit of ATP. And so collectively for our aerobic system, so knowing how those work and how one leads to the other is really important. Our third video, metabolic substrates, we're going to be going back, remembering our carbs, fats, and proteins, and figuring out how those generate ATP differently, so they have slightly different amounts, and how that interplays and includes something called the Cori cycle. So we'll take a look at that and how some metabolic substrates can be generated by our body when in need. Video 4 is going to look at the training effects and something called EPOC, or exercise post-oxygen consumption. And again, those have ties into our metabolism. And last but not least, we'll look at measuring metabolic activity, which largely will be covered in the lab section in greater detail. So that will be a slightly shorter video here, but will be good to view nonetheless and give you a great foundation for when we get to it in lab. Okay, so let's go back and review just in brief what anaerobic metabolism, to help set the foundation for us to understand better what aerobic metabolism is and how that differs. So again, the first 30 seconds of exercise, typically intense exercise, is predominantly uses ATP-PC system to generate ATP, but it's also quickly depleted as noted in 30 seconds. Okay, so from there, glycolysis picks up the slack. It's still anaerobic and will generate energy up to a maximum 2.5 minutes in any significant contribution. And so if we continue to maintain anaerobic activity, let's say our interval ends at about 2 minutes, what will happen is we'll have this end byproduct of glycolysis converted into lactate, right? So remember, lactate is kind of that a bit of a sponge there at the end of glycolysis to help soak up some hydrogen protons and also convert pyruvate. If, however, though, we don't have an anaerobic environment, so that means no oxygen, so we have oxygen present, what happens is pyruvate then gets shuttled over or carried over to our aerobic pathways, in particular our Krebs cycle. But first it has to get converted to acetyl-CoA, which we'll talk about in more detail. It was spoken about briefly previously in your anaerobic section. Okay, so again, we're focusing on when oxygen is available, and we'll understand why this is so important as well. One of the great things about aerobic pathways is we get to use all of the macronutrients to some degree in our aerobic pathway. However, they all need to be converted to something we can use before it enters the aerobic pathways. And if you recall from previous biology courses, or maybe you don't recall, but there is a saying where the mitochondria, as far as an organelle within our cell, is called the power plant, right? It's where all our energy, or the majority of our energy, comes from. So again, anaerobic systems, it produces energy, but it's in the cell cytoplasm, right? Or in muscles, it would be the sarcoplasm. And so we need to convert some of these metabolic substrates into forms to be taken into the mitochondria. Okay. Once it's there, then it can go through Krebs cycle, then it can go through the ETC, or electron transport chain, as you can see noted there. Now, when we think of aerobic activity, we really think about endurance activities. And to do with endurance activities, I wanted to try to cover this to help separate anaerobic and aerobic systems in our mind, or at least better understand how they interact together, so that we can build our discussion about aerobic activities along the way. Now, endurance activities do still have anaerobic, so no oxygen, components to them. And it depends on the type of the activity, the intensity. Okay, and what I mean by that, and time. So again, shorter, more intense bouts of fitness or endurance type activities, you'll see will be a greater amount of anaerobic activity or metabolism. If you get longer than, say, that 30-second window, you definitely start getting into more and more aerobic contribution to our overall energy production. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, let's look at some graphs, because that'll help explain that, or at least visualize it a little bit better. So we're going to look at different running lengths and duration, which also includes intensity, right? So 200-meter run, short amount of distance, relatively speaking, a short amount of time, relatively speaking, so 20 seconds tops. And therefore the intensity typically, especially at a high level, is much greater. So very high intensity, because you have a short duration of activity, you can put out a very large effort. Okay, so let's take a look here. So what this depicts, if you notice in the orange, that's our anaerobic bars, and then our aerobic is in the blue or the teal. On the left, or the y-axis, what you'll see is a percentage of total contribution from one of these two systems. Okay, at the bottom we have time on the x-axis. So what we see is, as we increase in time, going from 0 to 10 to 20 seconds, we have our anaerobic system, which starts at 80%, then starts contributing 65% as early as 20 seconds, okay? Our aerobic system already is kind of contributing about 20, and then we see about 35% to the overall amount of ATP that's getting used in this activity. Okay, so very short, high intensity. We can tell anaerobic is mostly here. So that would be your ATP, PC system, and your glycolytic system. We look here at a longer distance, so 400 meters, twice as long. And we notice a very similar thing. So again, high amounts of anaerobic metabolism contributing to our overall energy systems. But as soon as we get to about 30 seconds, you notice across over effect. So about 50-50 contribution. Already at 30 seconds, you're doing essentially an aerobic activity, or half aerobic activity, half anaerobic. Okay. Now we're into 40 seconds. Our aerobic system is taking over slightly relative to our anaerobic system, which here at the end is only contributing about 40%. Okay. So again, 400 meters. 400 meters takes under a minute. So under a minute's worth of activity, of high intense activity, one solid effort at 400 meters. We still see quite a bit of anaerobic contribution to the overall ATP being used. Okay. What if we go even a little farther? So let's double that. Let's say 800 meters. Well, now we're talking about getting close to 2 minutes worth of activity. Now remember, that tipping point for anaerobic contribution in any significant means is around 2 minutes. So at this mark, what does that really mean? Well, again, we see high anaerobic to start, hit 30 seconds. So in this particular activity, because it's much longer, the pacing of the activity is a bit different. And so we'll notice still quite early on, about 30 seconds, we see more aerobic contribution from aerobic metabolism than anaerobic. So a little bit different than the other activities we've seen that were very, very short. The intensity can stay much, much higher, much longer. Whereas here, some of that intensity gets traded off for the capacity to continue on at that pace longer using an aerobic system. Okay, again, troughs off with the anaerobic to about 20% as early as a minute and a half in. And then that's what can be maintained as far as an effort. Okay. Good. So that's 800 meters. So if, just to give you a bit of context as well, 400 meters is once around a standard track. 800 meters would be twice. If you look at 1500 meters, so now you're talking about almost 4 times around a track. So that's 1.5 kilometers, almost a mile. What we'll see is as early as 20 seconds on, again, because the intensity is brought down so that the duration of the activity can go longer. So the pacing, the intensity is brought down a lot sooner. Therefore, you don't need and don't have as large of a contribution from your anaerobic system. All becomes aerobic, and we can see that we get a nice plateau of that anaerobic contribution at about 20% here until, let's just say, over about a minute and a half, and then that drops down to 10%. So only 10% from about a minute and a half to 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes, we see about 10% contribution. Okay, so why did we cover all these distances in this manner? Well, one, these graphs highlight really, really well how intensity and how hard you're pushing during these activities can change the contribution of the anaerobic and aerobic systems, right? The higher the intensity, the more you push, the more anaerobic system you'll see. But it also demonstrates that at a maximum, at about 30 seconds, that's the absolute maximum where we'll see anaerobic contribution of energy be the highest. And even then it's 50-50%, or 50-50 with the aerobic system. Okay. It can and does contribute a lot less, a lot sooner if we bring that pace down, right? So it'll still contribute quite a bit for a longer period, but it's because we didn't totally extinguish its supplies early on. Okay. The other point, so the 2 points that this illustrates, the second point is how the two interplay. So again, it's not a light switch. It's not 100% anaerobic and then 100% aerobic. There's still contribution from both systems occurring for all activities at all points, right? It's a mixed contribution. Okay. So hopefully that helped you understand how the two systems might interact during different activities and how intensity, time, and and I guess type to a certain degree of activity will change this. Okay. will change the contributions of energy. Okay, so just to help us refocus in on the aerobic metabolism and how that system contributes to energy, what can we expect from it, how it might differ from the anaerobic system? Well, one of the things that we spoke about in the anaerobic system is when the anaerobic system started depleting, we found very high amounts of hydrogen protons, right, put off into the cell. Well, here in aerobic respiration, we don't have that, okay? And we'll see why later on. Two, it's more efficient and produces overall a greater amount of ATP per unit of metabolic substrate relative to the anaerobic system, but it does so at a much slower rate, and so it produces less ATP per second as far as like an amount or a quantity, but ultimately it's more efficient so that each substrate that goes through produces significantly more ATP. And again, we'll find out exactly what that looks like later. In addition to carbohydrates, which the anaerobic pathway is the only thing that can use as far as metabolic substrate, we'll also find that the aerobic system could use fat and sometimes protein. So we'll see how it does that. Waste products are water and carbon dioxide. So again, different than let's say glycolysis, which is primarily hydrogen protons and pyruvate. And then last but not least, we get to look at how the aerobic system will we'll understand greater why it's the primary source while we're at rest, the primary source of energy for our cells when we're at rest, but also during long, slow bouts of activity. Okay, and hint, it has a lot to do with the efficiency of energy that it can produce. Okay, so that was your first little overview and snapshot of the aerobic system. Hopefully that puts a little context about what it's all about and how it does sometimes crossover or how it is and is not related to the aerobic metabolic system. Great. Enjoy the rest of the video lecture series. Cheers.